Hello, everybody. This is Kiana Park from Spy Palm Partners. I'm today standing in for both Matt Hardy from AASHTO and Steve Gay from Federal Highways. On their behalf and on behalf of the sponsors of today's webinar, Federal Highways and AASHTO, welcome to webinar 28 in our Transportation Asset Management webinar series. The topic of today's webinar is Asset Management, Financial Plans, and Investment Strategies. This is the third in a four-part TAM webinar mini-series on elements of a transportation asset management plan, focused on understanding federal requirements that guide TAMP development and the experiences that state DOTs are having. The previous webinar addressed risk management. Our next webinar will address process improvement. For more information on the overall TAM webinar series, which has been running since 2012, visit tam-portal.com. That's tam-portal.com. From the click TAM events in the main menu to register for any webinar. You'll also find archives of previous webinars and links to videos and slides from today's webinar and in the past. And today's webinar will be posted on the site soon after this session. This is also the home of the AASHTO subcommittee, well, the former AASHTO subcommittee on asset management, now part of the performance-based management committee. And so on this, under the About menu, you'll see the information on this webinar. If you have any suggestions on future webinar topics or have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature on the control panel. We'll answer questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and we'll go through them kind of on a first come basis, and I'll just go through the sequence. So for the phone logistics, throughout today's webinar, the audience will be muted by default and only the presenters will be audible. The presenters should be sure to use their phone's mute button to unmute their phones in order to be heard. That covers the logistics for today's webinar, so I'll just say a few words of introduction on behalf of Steve Gay of Federal Highways. Federal Highways, in cooperation with AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, is very pleased to sponsor this webinar series. We feel it's a great way to help share practical, useful, timely information with the asset management community. Today's presentation returns to a topic that was covered in our 12th webinar from October 2014 and our 16th webinar from August 2015. We have 3 excellent presentations on the agenda today, so I'm just going to say a few words of introduction and provide some context for today's presentation. We've covered many topics over the course of these webinars. With today's topic, TAM, Financial Plans and Investment Strategies, we're taking a closer look at an area of great practical interest to transportation professionals, given the importance of the TAM financial plan in the TAMP rule. States required to prepare transportation asset management plans for NHS pavements and bridges. The TAMP must include a financial plan that spans at least 10 years and identifies funding and costs over that time. The TAMP also must include investment strategies for improving or preserving asset condition and achieving targets. FHWA defines financial plans as a long-term plan spanning 10 years or longer, presenting a state DOT's estimates of projected available financial resources and predicted expenditures in major asset categories that can be used to achieve state DOT targets for asset condition during the plan period and highlighting how resources are expected to be allocated based on asset strategies, needs, shortfalls, and agency policies. SHWA defines investment strategies as a set of strategies that result from evaluating various levels of funding to achieve state DOT targets for asset condition and system performance effectiveness at a minimum practical cost while managing risk. In our first presentation, we'll provide a more in-depth look at these concepts and requirements. SHWA has many useful resources available. There is a recently published TAM financial plan interim document. There is a multi-part asset management financial report series, and there are some excellent NHI courses. There is currently an introductory level web-based course on financial planning, and an instructor-led course is soon to follow. In addition, I encourage you to visit Federal Highway's Asset Management homepage to learn more. That address is on the screen. And finally, I just want to say that you're going to enjoy today's presentation. So now I'm going to quickly provide an overview of today's webinar, review our agenda, and introduce our speakers. Today's presentation includes 3 perspectives on TAMP development, focusing on TAM financial plans and investment strategies. Each of our presenters is helping to advance the state of the practice, and our presentations will highlight both successful approaches and some important lessons learned. Now, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to TAM financial plans and investment strategies, understanding specific approaches to bringing these elements together in the process of developing a TAMP that meets federal requirements, beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer how can agencies develop appropriate estimates for future costs and funding, how can states develop financial plans and investment strategies based on the data available, what are the key lessons learned for agencies seeking to develop an asset management plan that meets federal requirements, and most importantly, again, share lessons learned, ideas, and the knowledge we all have collectively. For today's agenda, I will introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, for our first presentation, we'll hear from my colleague Bill Robert of SpyPalm Partners with an introductory presentation focusing on TAM financial plans. Next, we'll hear from William Johnson of Colorado DOT, and for our final presentation, we'll have Matt Swift of Oklahoma DOT. And then, of course, we'll have the Q&A at the end. Just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature on the webinar menu bar anytime during today's presentation. And in response to the most frequently asked questions, yes, we will have the slides and video available after today's webinar at tam.portal.com. One final note for our presenters. In order to keep things moving along on schedule, I'll chime in to remind you when you have 2 minutes remaining in your allotted time. So, our first presentation today is from Bill Robert. Bill is Vice President of SpyPalm Partners and has over 20 years of experience in the transportation industry. Bill is currently developing TAMPs for many states, and he is the principal investigator for NCHRP Project 08103, addressing cross-asset resource allocation, and also for NCHRP Project 1912, Financial Planning for TAM, which is the topic of his presentation today. So with that, I will turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, Yana. So I'd like to talk briefly about some basic concepts in TAMP financial planning, and then talk more about the NCHRP Project 1912 efforts on TAMP financial plans. When I talk about that, we'll also get into the guide that we're developing for that project on TAMP financial planning and the web tool that's currently under development. Hyana already presented the definition of the TAMP financial plans from the recent asset management rule. This slide just repeats that definition. So a TAMP financial plan needs to be 10 years or longer in duration, needs to present the revenues and expenditures for key asset categories, and needs to be accompanied by a description of how resources will be allocated. Now, there are certain components of a financial plan that are specified in FHWA's asset management rule. This slide lists those components. So a TAMP financial plan needs to have estimated cost of future work by year and work type. It also needs to have a projection of funding levels that are expected to be reasonably available. It needs to identify funding sources and also include a calculation of asset value. Now, the financial plan is closely related to investment strategies. This slide repeats the definition of investment strategies. So this is basically a narrative description of how the state DOT will achieve its targets at minimum practical cost that accompanies the financial plan. And this slide lists the components of an investment strategy. Again, this is really a narrative description. Needs to explain how the TAMP financial plan and the strategies are influenced by performance gap analysis, life cycle planning, risk management, and anticipated funding. So in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about when we talk about a TAMP financial plan. With that, I'd like to move on to talking about NCHRP Project 1912. This is a project that we started about a year or so ago to prepare a guidebook on TAMP financial plans and give direction on a variety of topics related to this area, including how to estimate costs of future work, how to estimate funding levels, how to identify funding sources, and how to determine an asset value. SpyPond Partners is leading the work on this project, but we are pleased to have KPMG and University of Texas Center for Transportation Research on our team. We've also got a very engaged and wonderful panel that's overseeing the research, and TRB lead for this work is Andy Lemmer. I won't belabor the description of the project, but just to say it's organized into 3 phases, and we're currently on the 3rd phase of the project, which is to finalize the guidance for developing TAMP financial plans. We submitted the first draft of our guide back in January, and over the summer we did work on field validation of the draft guide, including meetings with Colorado DOT. We'll have William Johnson presenting in shortly on this topic, and Minnesota DOT. We also developed a few additional case studies profiling some examples of what other agencies in other industries and abroad are doing in their financial plans. So we're now finalizing the 2nd draft of the guidance and developing a web tool to accompany the guidance. We expect to complete the project this year, which means it'll most likely get published sometime in 2018. So next few slides address some of the key contents of this guide that we're developing. This slide just summarizes how the guide is organized. There's some introductory material, and really the core chapters are shown in the middle of this slide. There's a chapter on sources and uses, on forecasting, investment strategies, and asset valuation. So I'll just walk through some of the basic assumptions and topics covered in each of the core chapters. So on sources and uses, what we assume in the guide is that nearly every agency is going to have a mix of federal and state funds. Also, a TAMP financial plan might be limited to just show capital funding, but it could just as well include maintenance and operating funds as well. It's really a decision for each agency developing their TAMP exactly what funds are going to be covered by the TAMP. In particular, challenges that one may have in meeting the FHWA requirements include identifying NHS versus non-NHS expenditures, figuring out the uses by asset type, and also defining actions or investment types, work types, I should say, within their sources and uses. Some of the fundamentals discussed in the guide are listed here. So for sources, we talk about the different types of sources that what may typically be available. And then uses, we address asset management uses, how to address capital versus non-capital expenses, and fixed and variable costs. And finally, how to select the sources and uses to show in the financial plan. Now, the recommended steps that we detail in the guide for identifying sources and uses are, first, figure out the scope of the TAMP. What assets are being included, what systems are being included, what owners are being included. Then establish the set of sources and uses, structure the list of sources and uses, and then validate the list. A good way to do this is to go to the most recent year's budget and develop a diagram showing what money came in and where did it go. And then finally, document the assumptions behind the sources and uses, including the constraints on the sources and uses and the assumptions about how fixed costs are being handled, particularly if the financial plan includes operating and maintenance costs. So now moving on to financial forecasting, the basic assumption that we made in developing the guide is that DOTs already project their financial resources when they develop their STIP. But then the STIP projections typically just go out 6 years, sometimes a little more, sometimes, depending on where you're at in your STIP, you may not have 6 years of projections, but certainly not 10 years out. So going out to 10 years can be a challenge. Also, the STIP isn't necessarily delineated by National Highway System versus non-National Highway System costs, and it may or may not include all the sources and uses relative to the TAMP. So, as an example, obviously any big capital project is going to be in the STIP, but if an agency uses its maintenance funding to pay for pavement preservation, that may not appear in the STIP. So it may be necessary to supplement the STIP financial projections with more years and more types of funding. So the fundamentals we discussed in the guide, we talk about different ways of forecasting sources, from trend extrapolation to expert analysis to econometric models. We summarize FHWA guidance on financial forecasting, and then we talk about documenting assumptions, treatment of inflation, and how to address uncertainty. And the recommended steps on financial forecasting is figure out first who's responsible for what, who's going to be in charge of doing the financial forecast. Then review prior forecasts, forecast the revenues, forecast non-asset management uses. So by this we mean you'll forecast how much money you have available total, but then you need to figure out what other uses that are not related to asset management are there that will require some portion of that revenue. And then take the difference of that should be the funding available for asset management uses, and then document assumptions made in the forecast. And the next key chapter is on investment strategies and scenarios. So in this chapter, we actually talk about the process of projecting how much money will be spent on asset management uses, and we combine that with the discussion of defining your investment strategies. So the assumption here is that the financial plan and investment strategy are tightly linked, and really your final plan is a result of the investment strategy, not a separate entity from it. And then also in this part of the guidance, we saw a need to accommodate some different approaches to investment strategies. No agency, follows a pure strategy. There's always some sort of mix and some sort of combination of approaches. But what we talk about in the guide are an idealized top-down strategy where management systems are used to determine funding by asset class, as well as a bottom-up approach where projects are selected across asset investment types, and from there the cost by asset class gets summarized. And then also a key assumption here is that in developing the financial plan and investment strategy, an agency will need to define at least two scenarios, the expected funding and the funding required to achieve agency goals, or the desired state of good repair. And certainly an agency may wish to look at other scenarios as well. So the fundamentals we discuss in the guide on this are role of management system, cross-asset resource allocation, MODA, which is an area a lot of agencies are getting into, Delphi approach, and various other considerations. And there's a lot of steps in defining the investment strategies and scenarios. So this slide lists the steps. Essentially, it's an iterative process of projecting performance, using management systems, allocating the budget, observing the predicted performance, and then refining the projections until one has a projection of funding by use. The final key chapter is on asset valuation, so some basic assumptions there. DOTs already have some form of asset valuation through GASB 34, but the approach for asset valuation used for the TAMP may differ for that. So some of the fundamentals we discussed in the guide are GASB 34 in accounting terms, some basic alternatives to using GASB 34 for asset valuation, and guidance on selecting the best approach. And our recommended steps on asset valuation basically boil down to those shown here. We recommend obtaining the asset valuation from the GASB 34 valuation that the agency has done, then calculating a depreciated replacement cost, which is what we propose as an alternative, review both the methods, document the calculation in the plan, be it the replacement cost approach or the GASB 34 approach. So that's a very quick overview of what we've got in the guide. In addition to what I've talked about, we've got various introductory material and some materials on how best to communicate a financial plan. To accompany this guidance, we're currently developing what we're calling the TAMP Financial Planner, which is a web toolkit that produces some nice charts and graphs to accompany a financial plan. So the toolkit is designed to support a few of the basic use cases that an agency is likely to need as they develop their financial plan, including defining sources and uses, showing projected revenues and expenditures, and calculating asset value. And really the value of the toolkit is that it produces some various visualizations that you can copy and paste right into your financial plan. This is just an example screen from the toolkit showing configuration of, in this case, of sources. Another example screen showing the data entry. And then finally, just an example of a visualization of sources and uses. In this case, using a flow diagram to show on the left what revenues are coming in, and on the right, how are revenues being used. So that's a quick overview of the NCHRP 1912 project, and with that, I'll turn things back over to the next speaker.
All right, thank you, Bill. Our next presentation is from William Johnson of Colorado DOT. William is the Performance and Asset Management Branch Manager for CDOT. The branch leads CDOT's performance measures and asset management programs. by providing tools to effectively measure, analyze, forecast, and communicate to staff and stakeholders the performance of Colorado's transportation programs, processes, and investment decisions. William has been with CDOT for 17 years and previously served as the GIS Data Management Section Manager and Mobility Planner. He has a Master's of Science in Management and a BA in Land Use. William is also the lead point person for the validation work that's being done on the NCHRP 1912 project. Now I'll turn it over to William.
Hey, thanks. Hopefully you can see everything okay and hear me okay.
Looks great and sounds great.
So I'll start off with just a quick overview of CDOT. We have assets and we have money. Currently, CDOT is managing 11 assets under our asset management program, and out of our $1.43 billion budget, roughly $755 million of that goes to asset management. And I will explain a little bit in this presentation how that's done. It's very relevant when it comes to financial plan, and it's sort of singular in the methods that CDOT uses, how we go about using the plan to allocate our resources. A little bit more about CDOT, and we have this thing called 3 peaks. This is our technology, our people, our system. You could see asset condition and asset management roughly under that system peak. These are the 3 things that our department are concentrating on the most, asset condition being a base camp. It's relevant to point out here the improved customer experience very much deals with the outcomes of asset management. And you heard Bill mention MODA, multi-objective decision analysis. Well, I'm not going to talk about that in this presentation. I just wanted to make sure that the connection was made there. Quick overview of our asset management plan. Our asset management plan is called the Risk-Based Transportation Asset Management Plan. It was completed in December of 2013, so it's got a little gray hair in it now. In our plan, although I said we manage 11 asset programs when we had initially developed it, there were only 9 asset programs. Nevertheless, when the transportation rules came out and were finalized, we quickly discovered that there was a couple of disconnects in there, and our financial plan is one of them. So beyond just discussing how our financial plan chapter in the risk-based asset management plan was developed, I'll also talk a little bit about what are the gaps, what are the pitfalls that we have since implementation. Now, initial development. This is important here. You have to talk to a lot of people. A lot of people have to be involved. One of the tools I wish we had when we were going through initial development is, one, besides having those final rules and knowing what sections we needed to have, not just in our TAMP, but our financial plan, was tying back individual positions to who you needed to go to for information or who you needed to go to for content. Because in our risk-based asset management plan, beyond just trying to achieve minimum requirements within it, it was a transformative document that was more a document of business rules. So when we were developing things like the financial plan, we were changing the way that we did business. And I have a future slide in this talking about one of the pitfalls in doing that. Now, here's our chapter overview. We have, as Bill was going over, and as I sort of alluded to, some disconnects here in terms of the ways ours is laid out. We do have the historic funding levels in which, yes, we did use our budget to look at the most recent 10 years of how was asset management funded and what was the overall funding for different programs throughout CDOT. So it included much more than just looking at asset-specific things. One pitfall in doing this is that some of our past budgets were very project-specific. Where we've gone to now is a public-friendly budget where we have broad categories such as maintaining the system, which is all asset management, or maximizing the system, which contains things like TSMO within it. In the past, when we had to look at individual projects, somebody had to go through and identify whether or not this could be described as an asset management project or something else. We have a revenue overview, and I will show a very simplistic view of what our revenue overview looks like. We've since gone to something a little bit more detailed. I have three things grouped together in this presentation in terms of funds expected to be available for asset management, the future funding by the asset type, and financial sustainability. And it's something called program distribution. Every 4 years, we go through this planning activity where we update our investment plan for all of CDOT, which includes asset management over the next 20 years. And I'll show you what that looks like, kind of, but more so talk about the importance of it. Things that are not included within that our section on financial planning are investment strategies. They are, however, covered under a different chapter within our risk-based asset management plan. Also, our performance metrics are covered under a different chapter, and I think you'll find our performance metrics, while one may look at it as being extreme, they're very informative when it comes to actually executing an asset management program. In other words, spending resources, implementing the financial plan. So when we look at our historic funding levels, for us, it was important to note, as I said before, that sometimes things just showed up as projects, and we had to go through and look at the information from our past budgets as to what it was. The things weren't always classified as being an ITS asset or a fleet asset. So it took a little bit of research. This is where connections are important, not just between division offices like our Division of Accounting and Finance, but also region offices, because sometimes we actually had to contact individual program engineers or construction engineers and ask them, what project did you do? This all depends on how detailed you want. In our risk-based asset management plan, we went with a very generalized approach to sort of illustrating what our historic budget levels were. Now, this is a breakdown of our revenue, and this is even more generalized. We broke it down by state funds, the federal funds, and this thing called RAMP, which is the Responsible Acceleration of Maintenance and Projects program. It was something that was short-lived at the DOT here, but it really initiated our expenditure-based programming methodology. Again, when we went to asset management, we were changing business. One of the business changes that we were doing was to do more cash management and move away from saving money up until we had the total for the project to going off of, we'll spend money that we have now on the project and forecast what the expenditure will be for those projects. Now, the important thing to note here is we've had to go to something more advanced in that we've had to break down our budget by color of money a little bit more. An example of that is we had this thing called Faster show up. Faster is a license fee. The money that is used in asset management is supposed to be things that are critical for safety. So we've had to since identify those asset programs such as geohazards and tunnels that are very critical for safety, so we had access to that money. I think that what you'll find is as you're going through and developing your risk-based asset management plan, you'll have to make that judgment call if you're just going to take a general approach or really get into the details about the color of money. And it wouldn't be a CDOT presentation if I didn't put a slide in here that nobody could read. So here is that obligatory slide. This is what our program distribution looks like. And this is just a quick little snapshot. As I said, we forecast out by program area. In this case, our program area for asset management, you can see the top boxes here. Some of them are bundled, some of them are very disaggregate in nature, and they're all based on categories. So example would be our maintenance category. Maintenance is one of our asset management classes. Surface treatment, also one of our asset management classes. Are detailed there. We have the most recent past commission approved budget, as well as the forecast. And what this can be looked at is it has to be a balanced budget and program distribution, but it also is an expression of need for programs. When it comes to implementation, what we found is, while this was a great tool for both documenting what the asset class need is, we also found that there is heavy deviation pretty much from year one. Investment strategies are a part of our financial, it's part of a different section, as I said before, but this is just a snapshot of it for ITS equipment. And again, this is a document of business rules. So how do we go about making investment decisions in ITS equipment? For the 9 assets that are included within our risk-based asset management plan, 8 of them, we minus the maintenance stuff, 8 of them actually have the investment strategies documented within it to varying degrees. Now, performance metrics. This is where we started with performance metrics, and you'll see the 9 asset classes there. Some asset classes, such as bridge and pavement, have multiple performance metrics. Where we went with this was you could see the current performance is documented as well as an aspirational target. When we had initially developed this, our aspirational target was a loose definition of, given unlimited resources, what could you achieve? With the fiscally constrained target, this was what would we like to do with the asset. And of course, our performance gap was documented in this. I have another slide in here that shows how we mature over time in both our understanding of targets, but as well as understanding of current performance and investment in the performance gap and what is truly achievable. Now, here's where I start throwing people under the bus, including myself. These are things that are missing from our original risk-based asset management plan, but they're also things that we've worked on. Originally, when we did our asset valuation, we looked at it in terms of a use value. More generally, what that's saying is that what is the value that it provides to CDOT's customers? Again, tying back to what I was saying on the 3 peaks and the maintaining the system and the tie between asset management and improved customer experience, this is where we're really talking about what is the value that we provide to the customer. And we came up with a dollar amount of $55 billion. But then over time, we got a better understanding of what was really asked, and that we were looking at what is the current value or what is the replacement value for that asset, and we did another valuation study. In that valuation study, I want to point out that it is different from GASB 34, as Bill stated, that it's going to happen for some DOTs when they do this. For us, what we were looking at was how could we implement this in a business, and with that, we took more of a current versus a replacement cost for these assets. We have a giant spreadsheet where we went by individual assets, not just by asset class, but the individual assets within those classes, and calculated what the current value is, as well as calculated what a replacement value is. You can see the factors that we considered here in the gray box below. Another thing that was originally missing that we've since closed the gap on, but I'd say we probably still need more work in this area, is what are the financial risks for a department? When we had originally done our risk-based asset management plan, we had a section on risk that laid out a framework for risk and categorized things based off of agency, program, project, and residual risk. Residual risk being things that we commonly refer to as like climate change. And within that, as we got more developed, and what you're seeing here is just a snapshot of a further iteration of our risk register, is you begin to see that we recognize the financial risk components of it. The thing that we have problems with right now with this is actually quantifying the true financial risk for some of these events. Here's one thing I'll talk about when it comes to implementation and how things changed. Within our financial plan, it's great to have a document of all these things that occur, but eventually you actually have to make a decision on what you're going to do. In our TAM budget setting process, which this is a rough diagram of, it shows a dynamic between our asset investment management system, which is a tool, DTIMS by Dayton, that is a multi-asset management system. 10 of our 11 asset categories are in there, but when we go to the budget setting process, we bring in maintenance. It shows our performance scenarios, and this is the forecasted target achievement or forecasted performance based on different investment scenarios, hence the different lines. And then we use the wideband Delphi methodology, which is roughly everybody gets in a room, multiple people vote on what an allocation will be by asset class, and we go through various rounds until we come to a normalized consensus planning budget through it. And that's what this sort of documents. We do have information within our risk-based asset management plan that documents in a little bit of detail about how we go about doing this. However, I'll add that our work on our asset investment management system over the past 4 years has progressed tremendously, so we're able to bring in different elements, and we're starting to implement semblance of MODA within that. So it's gone beyond just asset condition, and we're now going towards implementing other benefits that our users are looking to achieve. This one, while it's not required, again, I'll point back to we were looking for a transformative business document. It's great to really document things in terms of roles and responsibilities. It's great to document performance versus investment. It's another thing that that investment actually turns into a project. And how is that done? That was immediately after finishing our risk-based asset management plan. This is one of the first things that we did was documented our project selection process. Again, while it's not a requirement that it be put into our financial plans, this is probably one of our strongest pieces because people wanted to know where was the information coming from, who makes the decision, who is responsible for what is my role in all of this, beyond just, hey, there's some dollars and there's some performance. It says really documenting what are the business rules and who's doing what in terms of roles and responsibilities for turning those investment strategies into actual deliverable projects. Here's one thing that we just walked through this door is metric refinement. I showed you where we started off with and where we're at now. And I'll point back to our aspirational targets. Well, at one time we said, given unlimited resources, what could you achieve? Now our aspirational target more resembled what would you like to achieve? You know, it's a small change in semantics, but a big change in terms of dollar value that you're looking at in order to achieve your target. Also, when it came to our fiscally constrained target, the blue line that you see there, the definition changed from what would you like to achieve to given a fiscal constraint, what is achievable. Again, small change in semantics, but it allowed us to refine where before for all of our 11 asset programs, we were looking at a need of $1.6 billion. By adjusting our metrics and our targets a little bit, we were able to look at something, and I'll say it's still sort of an unreasonable number, but it's more reasonable, a $1.2 billion need every year. Here is an example. Sorry, I have 2 slides that don't give you any information, but what this shows is our asset categories. The next column is the performance measure. Then we have the fiscally constrained target, the old one, and then the adjusted target for fiscal constraint, our old aspirational target, and then our proposed aspirational target, as well as a general reason for target change. The stuff that you see in red is an actual change, and you'll see that not only are we recommending a change to our targets, but we recommended some clarifications or some changes to our performance measures. An example of that is over time, our traffic signals went from a use life metric to more of a condition-based metric. Sorry for the picture on this one. I have last rat standing, and I couldn't really find a rat that was suitable. So the pizza rat was the closest thing that came to it. But I think it exemplifies what we as asset managers do, is we try to grab the biggest slice of pie and hoard onto it. But what I mean really by last rat standing here is what we're experiencing right now is a lot of change in staff. Our staff are getting older. Through attrition, we're losing not only the position, we're losing the knowledge. We're also losing the understanding of the roles and responsibilities. So one thing I wish we would have done better starting back in December of 2013 was actually document some of the process changes that we made outside of things like diagram. It needs narrative, and that narrative is important because as staff changes, the history of why those decisions were made become much more relevant, because what we're finding here at CDOT is we're slipping back into the same old problems. And I'm the last rat standing here at CDOT, where if I go back to 2013 when I started in my role, we had made some decisions, and I am the last person left who has knowledge of the decision, knowledge of the documentation of those decisions, but I've apparently been doing a poor job of communicating the history. And that communication, while I'll take the heat for it, it only comes up when the problem comes up. The next notable thing that I want to point out, I have a dollar sign there. It changes every single year. Something will come up. For us, TAM is the largest pot of money that we have at CDOT for construction dollars. So if there's ever a construction need, people are looking to get their hands into that pot. Also, when it comes to our legislature, there's always a bonding initiative or a threat of a bonding initiative that comes up. The important thing to remember here is that with CDOT in Colorado, in nature, is it's very rare that a bonding initiative comes up with an assigned revenue source or a new revenue source. It typically leverages existing revenue source. And when you put asset management in a position where it's not the largest construction dollar pot, the revenue source tends to be asset management. Also, as I stated before, our exercise in adjusting our performance measures and targets is you will see that every year as you're not able to afford things, so grows your funding gap. And every year, with the effects of people dipping into the asset management pot, or if you have a bonding initiative, you'll see that financial need continue to grow. What it means is not necessarily, hey, I got a gap in terms of funding need and target achievement. It means that you have to do, one, is a better job of telling the transportation story and telling the story of the overall benefits of asset management, more like a MODA approach, but also that you're having to explain all the good things that you're doing, irrespective of your ability to achieve those targets. And it's sort of one of those areas where you're having to justify that you're doing continuous improvement within this. With that, I'll leave you with my contact information here. On things like our valuation study, there's a webinar that we conducted in October of 2016. You can find it there, as well as a link to our risk-based asset management plan for information. Thank you.
Thanks, William. So if you have any questions for William, please enter them into the Q&A feature of the webinar tool. Our next presentation is from Matt Swift of Oklahoma DOT. Matt was named the Strategic Asset and Performance Management Division Engineer for ODOT in 2016. He previously served as the Pavement Management Engineer. As Division Engineer, Matt oversees the data collection, analysis, and reporting for ODOT's Highway Asset and Performance Management System, as well as ODOT's planning function. Matt began his career at ODOT in 2004 as a project engineer in roadway design and held that position until becoming the pavement management engineer in 2012. In 2015, he was one of 2 selected to represent Oklahoma in the first Emerging Leaders Program with WSDOT. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from University of Arkansas and a master's degree in business administration from the University of Central Oklahoma. He and his wife, Susan, have 3 children and live in Jones, Oklahoma. Now I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Yana. Like Yana said, I'm Matthew Swift with ODOT. I'm going to give a brief overview of where we are with the Oklahoma TAMP development process and focus specifically on the financial planning part of it. So our TAMP development efforts focus on achieving three primary objectives, and our first and primary objective is the development of a federally compliant transportation asset management plan. And related to this, our second objective is to improve transportation asset management through the department. We also want to identify strategies that will improve Oklahoma's asset performance given the resources available. So the mission of the Oklahoma DOT is to provide a safe, economical, and effective transportation network for the people, commerce, and communities of Oklahoma. We also have some primary goals that were identified in the most recent long-range transportation plan, and our TAMP efforts fit within the ODOT mission and the long-range transportation plan goals, specifically our infrastructure preservation goal. So our infrastructure preservation goal is focused on bridges and pavements, and bridges are measured by structurally deficient bridges. Pavements are measured by condition index, focusing on good, fair, poor. Historically, Oklahoma bridge condition has been fairly poor, and so in recent years, there's been a real push to eliminate our structurally deficient bridges, and we have a goal to achieve less than 1% structurally deficient bridges by 2020. Because of our primary focus on bridges, however, less resources have been devoted to pavements recently. As part of the TAMP development process, we came up with a TAM mission statement, and that is the ODOT Transportation Asset Management Program will optimize financial resources in a data-driven, risk-based decision-making process that maintains and improves the state's transportation infrastructure in a publicly accountable manner. We decided to include pavement and bridge assets in our first TAMP, and our intention is to add additional assets as we mature in our asset management process. So we were developing our TAMP through 4 phases of work. In our first phase, we documented current practices and gathered the information we needed to get started. In the second phase, we focused on the results we wanted to achieve and the priorities we had for the TAMP through a series of workshops. In our current phase, we're working on building our TAMP and developing a roadmap of what we want to achieve with the TAMP. And after we finish the TAMP, we'll move into the 4th phase where we'll implement. So we've conducted a series of workshops to get all of our stakeholders engaged in the development of our TAMP. We've completed a majority of these, and these workshops have been important education sessions where the stakeholders have learned about the components of TAM and its complexity. So I think one of the things that we were able to do is get involved a bunch of construction engineers, maintenance engineers, field people that normally didn't have much interaction with data to kind of get them familiarized with the process. So in the first 2 workshops, we talked about basics for the TAM and what the role of performance measures was in the TAM. We had a pavement and bridge management workshops next, and we ran condition forecasts using ODOT pavement and bridge management systems. For our pavement management workshop, we used our pavement management system to generate the 10-year condition performance forecasts. We used the workshop to familiarize everyone with the parameters in our pavement management system and the associated assumptions with that. For our bridge management workshop, we decided to use FHWA's MBIAS system for our bridge forecast. And at our risk management workshop, we developed a risk register and prioritized the risks we had to mitigate. Our 6th workshop dealt with financial planning, and the bulk of this presentation will deal with what we did at the financial planning workshop. So we're planning on having our TAMP building workshop in the next few months. So July 25th of this year, we held our financial workshop. And this chart shows that the relationship between historical budget and the level of full-time ODOT employees. And so in the last 5 years, our budget's grown about 50%, but the level of our full-time employees has remained fairly consistent. So in fiscal year 2016, 77% of the total ODOT budget was allocated to highway-related spending. For project-related spending from our construction work plan, you can see that 48% was spent on bridges and 42% on pavement. So we have an 8-year construction work plan that is basically the guide for everything we do construction-wise. The first 4 years of that 8-year work plan are what we turn into the STIP. So 48% of this budget was then spent on the NHS. And to get some perspective on this, about 1/3 of our state maintained network is on the NHS. So in our 2017 construction work plan, there's a focus on bridge spending to get our bridge condition to the desired state of good repair. And so it shows we got 28% of this spending went into pavement. Other is 18%. And this other includes interchanges, safety, mobility, and that type of thing. This does not include any maintenance we're doing. So our financial staff forecasted that revenues would be flat over the next 8 years at about $1.5 billion per year. And we further broke this down into construction work plan by bridges and pavements and by division. And we get an average of approximately $796 million are dedicated to bridge and pavement assets annually. When we add additional funds from routine maintenance and asset preservation, which is separate from the construction work plan, we estimate we'll have approximately $1 billion a year to spend on bridge and pavement assets. So the difference being with our asset preservation plan, these are just preservation strategies, real thin overlays, types of things that wouldn't affect any kind of structural value. So the asset preservation plan is a 4-year plan. Our construction work plan is an 8-year plan. So when we look at this graph, we talk about our funding assumptions on a 10-year cycle, and you'll see both historic trends, so on the front end, and actual performance for interstate projected in the future. As we go through, this is the same graphic for non-interstate NHS. You can see condition declines a little bit more. And then we look at non-NHS. This is just state-owned routes, and the condition declines even further. So for our bridge forecast, using in-bias, we're predicting a gradual increase in our good condition of bridges by deck area, and poor bridges stay fairly consistent over that 10-year period. So we conducted a series of exercises during the financial workshop to get the stakeholders to dig into the data and the forecast and how our bridge system and pavement management system works. So in the first exercise, we asked groups to review the baseline assumptions and allocations to pavement and bridge assets and the results from the performance forecast. In the second exercise, we asked groups to assume we'd get a 25% budget cut across all programs and discuss how they should manage that with a reduced budget. In the third exercise, we let each of the divisions view the results and discuss how they would integrate that data into division business practices. So we have 8 field divisions in Oklahoma. We've got a centralized office where we do our design, and then kind of these 8 field divisions do all of our construction and maintenance. So exercises 1 and 2 were for a network level review, and exercise 3 was for a division level review. So these exercises revealed a general comfort with the approach at the statewide levels, as we just kind of talked through how pavement management and bridge management works, and if you've got a limited amount of funding and you need a certain performance, here's what we need to do. So the participants found that the underlying data quality should improve in the future and that division level forecasts should be accurate. So I'm sure that lots of other states are having this situation, but in the last couple of years, we've had cuts to our budget that have impacted us, and this year was no different for us. So the state financial forecasts have kind of gave us a reduction in revenue, and our 2018 construction work plan reflects those reductions. Just last week, excuse me, our Transportation Commission adopted the 8-year work plan, which kind of lays out what we'll be doing for the next couple of years. So how this affects the TAMP is that the current budget situation was kind of put us into a slowdown for the TAMP development as we waited for a final call on what that work plan was going to look like. So we knew the forecast was being cut, and we put a halt on the TAMP development for the last couple of months. Now that the 8-year work plan has been finalized, we need to adjust the assumptions we made at the financial workshop. So we're currently rerunning our payment and bridge forecasts. We'll need to review those numbers and determine what our new investment strategies will be for the TAMP. We'll need to generate new tables for the revenue forecasts, but we feel like we've accomplished a lot at the workshops, and we'll be able to adjust those forecasts and use the TAMP billing workshop to finalize the decisions that are needed to complete the TAMP in time for the April 2018 submittal. So with that, I'll wrap it up and hand it back to Hyuna. I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can.
Thanks, Matt. All right, that concludes our presentations for today. Thank you to all of our presenters. Now it's time for the Q&A part of the webinar. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar, and I'm going to take it in the order as you've typed them. So let's start with the first question, which is for Bill in the first presentation, and it's how will the guide address coordination with MPOs, especially, MPOs, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Obviously, there is a lot of coordination that's needed with MPOs with the new rules. Strictly speaking, I think where the MPO coordination is probably most important is on implementing the PM2 rule, where MPOs can set their own 2- and 4-year condition targets, and then they can choose to either support the state targets or set their own targets. We don't actually get into PM2 in this guide, but obviously it does relate closely with developing the asset management plan. I guess we speak to the need for MPO coordination and present it mainly as a challenge, because I think where it really comes up in the financial plan is that if the state is there's a lot of locally owned NHS, then the financial plan really needs to include expenditures for that portion of the NHS that's locally owned, and I think that's where the MPO coordination comes into play. So I guess what we say is we address the importance of it and the need for it, but there's no special magic there. We mainly just highlight that this coordination has to happen.
The next question is also for Bill. How will the other elements of the planning process be integrated?
Yeah, I guess that's another great question. So the TAMP definitely relates to other elements of the planning process. The TAMP needs to be considered in developing the long-range transportation plan, and then in developing the TAMP, the agency's goals and objectives that have been considered in the long-range transportation plan, other documents need to be incorporated. So there's a pretty tight link between the TAMP overall and the planning process. For the financial plan in particular, it's all about the dollars. So the biggest link is really in the revenue projections, and now different states have different levels of integration between the STIP development and the planning process and the TAMP, but ideally the same revenue projections would be used across the board. So we speak to the value of that, and really in our section on revenue projections, we talk about building on the STIP revenue projection and adding more years to that, and adding additional revenue sources if you need to that, but really building on that. But there's other connections to planning as well, and I think in our investment strategies section where we talk about defining the investment strategy and defining the scenario, we try to address this issue of reviewing the initial results of an analysis, evaluating those results with respect to the agency's planning goals, and then revising their allocation of resources as best they can to support those goals, and kind of iterating. So I think the most direct link between planning and programming is in incorporating the STIP revenue projection and building on that, but then it also comes into play in analyzing different scenarios to finalize the investment strategy. So again, there's no special trick that you can just unfurl. I mean, we really just emphasize the need to coordinate between these different areas, and that appears in multiple places in the guide.
And then a final question for you, Bill. Are the toolkits you showed going to be available to states to use?
Yeah, that's the whole idea, is to make them available. So right now, probably members of our panel, including William, who I know is on the call, are eagerly awaiting the next draft of our guide. And so the guide will document the tool, and then the final product of the research will be will be the final guide, but also will deliver the final tool. And what we've done in other NCHRP projects where we've done some sort of web tool is basically made that available, and then hosted it in its current form for some amount of time that we coordinate with TRB or AASHTO or whoever goes on and takes on the research products going forward. So yeah, I mean, it would be available, and there'd be a link either published in the guide or accompanying the guide, and the intent would be for people to use it.
I'll just add that most likely it's going to get added to the TAM portal, where there is a tools part, and the links like that to existing available tools will be there.
Yeah, and we've done this kind of thing before, like the TAMP research roadmap is another example where there was a web tool for one of the 836 projects where we worked on templates for asset management plans. There's a web tool. Yeah, we did look in our initial version of the guide. We started with a spreadsheet, and what we saw is it's really hard, and this is what we saw through the testing with the agencies. It's really hard to generalize how different agencies are going to represent their TAMP financial plan. So we didn't, and the visuals that you want to generate to illustrate the TAMP financial plan, you can do a lot in Excel or other spreadsheets, but you couldn't do all the things we wanted to do, and it was hard to make it generic other than just giving somebody a copy of Excel and saying go for it. So we saw there's a lot of value to having a web tool, so that's the reason we went that direction. But the idea is to make it available to people. It's actually easier to distribute than a spreadsheet because they just have to point their browser to the website.
All right, thanks, Bill. So the next question is for all of the presenters. So could any of the presenters comment on how the financial plan and investment strategies cover non-state DOT-owned assets? For instance, NHS assets under turnpike authorities, counties, etc. Why don't we start with you, William?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a quick answer. It doesn't, and we're going to be going through and update our asset management plan in the short term, where it will include that. One thing that I do want to add is we didn't necessarily ignore this within our original risk-based asset management plan. It was just such an unknown quantity at that time. In Colorado, roughly 10% of our NHS is owned not by the state DOT. And while we have just a small percentage that's owned by like a toll authority, we don't have turnpikes. We have cities and counties that own the off-system NHS. When one of the first activities that I did, and this is sort of dating me a little bit, going back to 2012 when we got the requirements for the enhanced NHS, I was the one who actually went around the state trying to convince people to pull back on their NHS or the principal arterials that would become NHS under threat that we would not be able to afford to do projects for the off-system NHS. And it's probably a good thing that we did that in 2012, because as we're approaching things now and looking at the information from our expected revenue and our financial plan, that's sort of ringing to be true. We're not in a position where we could truly afford to do those projects. The one thing that we have to remember, though, is when we're talking about things like MPO boundaries, it's all the NHS, not just the on-system, not just the off-system. And I think what will play into that in our next iteration of our plan and the next chapter of financial planning is that we will focus on the MPO areas a little bit more on those condition needs, but just for state-owned NHS.
Yeah, ODOT is very similar to CDOT in that regard. We have probably, just off the top of my head, probably 1,000 miles of 1,000 miles on the NHS that we don't own between the turnpikes and cities, and so we did a similar thing in that we've asked cities to remove things from the ENHS. We've had pretty good success. Not everything was taken off, and so we collect data on all the NHS routes, and so we're looking at condition of that, but we don't have the financial data for what the turnpike is going to do or what cities are going to do in that regard. And so I expect that as we develop this program and we work with our MPOs then and with the turnpike in a little bit, I think that'll start to align, but right now we don't have that.
So yeah, this is a good question. Based on the rule, if you've got locally owned NHS assets or other owners of the NHS, then they should be included in your TAMP and in your financial plan. But then this requires a lot of coordination to try to get information from them and to include. And they're not under any obligation to do this. I mean they obviously need to coordinate with you and so forth, but there's no the requirements for the state DOT to prepare the TAMP, not for an MPO or a local agency to prepare the TAMP. So the burden is all on the state side on getting this information. I think we in the NCHRP 1912 guide we'll discuss some of these things, but probably the best examples are really from what different states are doing, like Oklahoma and Colorado. The one other example I could mention is that California has gone through the process of developing its asset management plan, and in this case, a large portion, around a third or so, of the NHS is owned by other state and local agencies. So that's been the biggest issue that they've had, is trying to estimate the financial side and conditions and everything else for the locally owned portion of the NHS. So they have now developed a draft. They're reviewing it internally, and their draft TAMP does include estimates of the local spending on the NHS and future projections of NHS spending and future projections of locally owned NHS conditions. So they're doing it all, but it's a lot of work to try to address that. Obviously, more work depending on how much NHS there is that's owned by other agencies.
Can I add to my answer here, Bill? And key on just a couple of things you said. The data collection and the analysis. For all NHS, Colorado does do data collection, so it includes both on-system and off-system. When it comes to analysis, the one thing that I promise my MPOs was that I would look at the ability to use our asset investment management system to begin to forecast performance and investment and to develop potential treatments. And what I've been told is that we are capable of doing it, but it's based on that limited amount of data collection that we have. For full NHS, it's roughly 3 years.
Thank you. Our next question is for William and others if they want to answer it as well. Where have the asset valuations you discussed gained any traction with CFOs or financial statements? William?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the approach that we took was to use a non-GASB 34 methodology for our latest asset valuation, which essentially means that it really doesn't show up in any financial statements outside of the TAM financial plan. And in discussions with FHWA, they said that's perfectly appropriate to do. When it comes to getting any traction with CFOs, I would say the bigger question is how can that information be used for investment decision making? And for us, it ties back to everything in our approach to risk and resilience, where based upon emergency response requirements for the replace in kind versus betterment, we actually can use those figures, especially when it comes to evaluating alternatives. When it comes to things that are on a more cyclical replacement, such as culverts, we could use that information to begin to forecast. Culverts is one of those areas where we're exceeding our performance target, but we can use the valuation methodology to guide us onto where our needs should be in terms of every year if we're going to replace things on a cyclical basis and remain above our performance targets. So we didn't necessarily have a need to either include this as part of a financial statement or really to get any traction with CFOs. Ours was more business driven, and while the CFO is part of our TAM Executive Oversight Committee, they're one amongst many executive managers, and it's that group that we were really trying to speak to.
All right, and then this is the last question we have, and it is asset management exempt from inclusion in the requirement for inclusion in the TIP and MTP, especially in meeting the financial constraint requirement? I think, Bill?
I can take a shot at it. William may or Brad may have more to add. I think the short answer is no, but the longer answer is maybe. So the short answer, any capital project you have that's got federal funding, whether it's asset management or not, has got to be in the STIP and the regional transportation plans. So so in that sense, no. And whatever the constraints are, they would apply, regardless of whether it's an asset management project or not. Having said that, some of the projects that you might include in your asset management plan might be projects that are being handled through maintenance or operating funding, and in that case, they wouldn't necessarily be in the STIP. So there could be, it's just a question of how the TAMP is defined and how different actions are treated. But it could be that your TAMP just has larger capital projects, but it could be, depending on what you do through operating funding, that if you do a bunch of pavement preservation or bridge preservation work, that might be something that you want to address in the TAMP that may not go into the STIP.
If I could add to that, Bill, there's one other category, and that thing is if you have an asset management project that has been identified but not necessarily funded, you may or may not want to put that on your STIP, but definitely if a budget action has occurred, it needs to be in your TIP. Well, one thing for MTPs is the MPO, the way that the rule has been explained to us multiple times, they do not necessarily have to go line by line and say that this project is an asset management project. However, in part of their MPO evaluations, it would be a good idea to have something similar to that, because they do have to tie in what they're doing to either achieve their own performance targets or in line with the state DOT performance targets.
All right. Thank you, guys. So it looks like we're done with the questions. So the next webinar will be held on December 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TAM process improvement. So this will be the final session of our mini-series on TAM. And so we'll let you know shortly who the presenters are for that webinar. And you will hear from us soon about the next set of webinars on the schedule. So if you have ideas, please send them along. I hope you'll be able to join us in the future, in the December, as well as the next series of webinars. Additional webinars will be continuing for quite a while, scheduled every 2 months for another 2 years. So keep sending us ideas and we will add them to the queue for webinar topics. And just a final reminder, for more information, visit tam-portal.com. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to our speakers again. Goodbye.